Welcome back to episode 26 of the Thinking 8 podcast. So today we have a special guest, Dr. Rodger Shanahan, who is a non-resident fellow at the West Asian Program for the Lowy Institute. He's a former army officer with operational service with the UN in South Lebanon and Syria, with the PBG in East Timor in Beirut during the 2006 war and in Afghanistan, whilst also being a part-time member of the Refugee Review Tribunal. He was the former director of the Army's Land Warfare Studies Centre and has also been posted to the Australian Embassies in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. And Dr. Shanahan has MAs in International Relations and Middle East Studies from the ANU and a PhD in Arab and Islamic Studies from the University of Sydney. I hope that's all correct because that was just off the web. Thanks for coming on.
That's all right.
First, I'll probably ask is, how did you kind of get into that space? So from the Army, I guess, is when you started. So what's your story really? Like, how old were you when you kind of decided you wanted to be in the Army? What's the process behind that?
No, I went straight from school. It was something I always wanted to do. And I was the last of the classes that spent 4 years at RMC Duntroon before the Defence Force Academy opened up. And so I was accepted to Duntroon contingent on passing the HSC and getting the marks to do a degree at New South Wales Uni, which you did at Duntroon. So I finished school in December, and then was on a bus to Canberra at the end of January. So it wasn't went from kind of schoolboy into the army.
How long did you know you wanted to do that for?
Say again?
How old were you when you knew you wanted to do that?
No, I was always interested in the military, and it seemed like a good idea. You got a tertiary education. I liked being outdoors, and I was a city boy, so lots of time in the outdoors, lots of sport, which I liked. So kind of annual paid, so kind of all those kind of things appealed to me. And I did a chemistry degree to start with, so which was completely useless to me, but that's one of the things that you kind of do, and you learn along the way. But back in the day when you did the HSC, really, if you were looking for high marks, you really had to do the hard sciences. So I was probably more suited to arts, but I was pretty good at passing exams in the sciences, but not actually practically using it for anything. And so I ended up doing a chemistry degree, but I've never actually had
that was going to be my next
chemistry after I finished. So,
but did you sign up in is it just infantry? Because I had a friend who his original plan was to go straight from high school into the army. And from my conversations with him, I'm not sure if I recall correctly, but I'm pretty sure everything was full. There was like a 2-year wait list, except for like IED testing or something that he didn't want to do. So he ended up waiting, and then he just ended up not doing it. So is he talking shit, or is that?
I mean, I don't know. It's I really don't know what the contemporary recruitment procedures are. Sometimes there's a wait because they've got to wait for courses to start, and sometimes people are putting in particular jobs in the army depending on their particular attributes that they may have or they're identified with. But infantry is the largest part of the army, so there's a lot of people who go to infantry.
You signed up for infantry?
Anyway. No, you don't sign up for anything. So when you're at Duntroon, or for the 4 years, you go in, and then in your final year, you applied for particular parts of the army that you wanted to go to, and then you were allocated to particular parts of the army based on requirements and a whole range of other things. So I was an artillery officer when I graduated, and you do regimental time, so in artillery units, but you also do other appointments that are not artillery related. So that's what the army posting cycle is. You have your core jobs, which is the trade, for instance, that you're supposed to specialize in, but you're also posted to operational headquarters or training appointments or administrative appointments or army headquarters. So a whole range of stuff, and that's part of the variety that the army can offer. But it also means that you're kind of uprooted every couple of years and moved somewhere else. So it's just the nature of the job, and it's good in parts, it's hard in parts, but that's just, there's no way of changing it. The military's pretty well always been the same. They probably always will be the same, which makes it harder for families as you get older with children. So people are less mobile, but the army would still like you to be mobile. So that inevitably causes tensions along the way. But that's, again, the nature of the beast.
Yeah, okay. How long was the training for in Canberra? Or were you moved around during training as well?
No, it's 4 years in Canberra. So at Duntroon, and so the start of the year was purely military training until the university year started, and then you were in uniform and did parades in the morning, but you just had normal series of lectures as you would to complete whatever degree that you were doing, and then one afternoon a week and Saturday morning was normally some military training, some military lessons, and then Saturday afternoon was sport, and then the rest of the weekend off. And you also had the university holidays as well. And then at the end, after exams, you also had a block of military training. So that was the first 3 years. And then your final or your fourth year was purely military training. And sometimes, that you could exercise in different parts of Australia during that year.
Okay. And after the 4 years, you obviously graduate. Yep. What was the next step for you? Do you just get deployed, or like?
You get posted to a unit, and you normally stay in that unit as a junior officer, as a lieutenant. You're learning your trade, so you're normally there for 3 years, 2 or 3 years in the one unit. I got posted to a unit at Holsworthy in Sydney, and so for the first 3 or 4 years of your post after graduation, you're normally in what's called your core CORPS, the infantry, armour, artillery, engineers. You're doing those kind of jobs largely, and you can do them for a bit longer after that. But once you reach the rank of captain, then the army wants to introduce you to a bit more variety. So I was on a brigade headquarters, for instance, as a captain, but also in an artillery regiment. So you get moved around again. So they try, and the army is good about what it wants is general service officers, so people who have a specialisation in a particular part of the army, but they also want them to be have at least one other string to their bow. So they want people who are generally employable in a wide range of training or operational and regimental appointments, so that they can. It makes it easier for the posting and planning cycle to put people into particular positions. So that's why you get 2 years or sometimes 3 years in one job and then get moved on to another job. And people are always coming in at one end and going out at the other end. So there's a constant stream of people coming through, and that's just the nature of the beast and how militaries the world over operate.
Okay, so you were in Holsworthy for 2 years, 2 to 3 years.
I was there for quite some time. I did.
I've got a friend in Holsworthy, actually.
Yeah, I was there. I did a number of postings in Holsworthy, but I was there for a bit over 7 years.
And was that artillery officer?
That was for 5 of those years were in artillery roles, and 2 years on the brigade headquarters as an operations officer. And then I got deployed with the UN to the Middle East as a captain. And then I came back and I was in Canberra at Army headquarters for a couple of years. And then I got posted back to Holsworthy, and then got deployed to Timor. My unit got deployed to Timor while I was at Holsworthy. So that was 1999. And then after I came back from that, there was Staff College in Queenscliff, and then back to Sydney and Victoria Barracks, and then posting to, and then the postings to the embassies came. So I was 1 year in the embassy in Saudi, and then 2 in Abu Dhabi, and then I came back. And by that stage, I came back to Canberra, and I discharged in that year that I came back. It's time to move on.
Yeah. Okay. Well, lots of things to touch on. That's so interesting compared to most people, just like regular office jobs, come home, go to work, come home, go to work. You've obviously moved around and had a completely different path. What's it like working at the UN?
Other people moved around a lot more than I have, but it's good, and it's good when you're younger, I suppose, because you get exposed to lots of different parts of Australia, and you're outdoors a lot. It becomes less kind of interesting when you're kind of moving up the chain, and you're effectively administering a large and complex organisation. So all the kind of office jobs that are replicated in the commercial world, there's equivalent types in the military where you are doing essentially an office job, keeping the wheels turning, and it becomes less interesting then. But also just the constant churn of not knowing where you're going to be in 2 years' time. That is good for a while, and then the variety bit kind of wears off after a while, particularly when you have family and young kids, and the uncertainty is not as welcome as it used to be, I suppose. But again, as you keep on saying, there's no way around it. It's just the nature of the beast. But yeah, certainly, particularly in the younger years, moving around a lot and going exercises in different places and getting to see a lot of Australia. Yeah, exactly what kind of wanted to do, and being in charge of soldiers. It's all, I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah. What's it like working for the UN, with the UN? I don't know how to describe it.
It was quite a long time ago, but it was it was good insofar as there was 6 months we lived in Damascus, and then you would go on observation posts on the Golan Heights, which have been static for years and years and years, and you're essentially just making sure nobody went across the demarcation lines, and you'd go on foot patrols with some of there was an Austrian and a Polish battalion, depending on where your observation post was. So you'd go out for a week with one other person from another country, and then you would stay in that position for a week, and then you'd come back to Damascus, for a week, or just depend. So it was kind of a bit week on, week off ish. Sometimes 10 days off, and so there wasn't a lot going on really, and you were tied to the observation post for most of the time. And then the second 6 months, we lived in a place called I've just forgotten it, in Nahariya in northern Israel, and you would go into southern Lebanon, which is occupied by the Israelis at that point, and you were in a 4-man observation post at that time. It was much more operationally focused, many more things going on, and you were mobile. So out of those 4 people, normally 2 would be out in the vehicle, patrolling your area of responsibility for most of the time, and 1, if not both people, or the other 2 people were in the observation posts. The observation post was much more fortified and much bigger, and then but you didn't operate at night, and so one person would just cook meals for everybody else, and so that was more interesting. But Damascus is a much more interesting place to live, obviously. So that was kind of the way, and there are other kind of postings within that area. But doing Damascus for the first 6 months and then South Lebanon for the second 6 months was kind of perfect perfect sequencing, and I was lucky enough for that sequencing to to occur in my favour. So no, that was good, and it also does. There are always limitations about the United Nations and peacekeeping forces, but in one thing it did kind of teach me is particularly in the South Lebanon thing, where there are people living in South Lebanon, the only unbiased observers or people who can report on what actually occurred are United Nations personnel who don't have a dog in the fight. So it's one of those things. Are they effective when they're there? Yes. Could they be more effective? Possibly. What's the alternative if they weren't there? And that's the question, that there is no alternative than not having them there. So it's one of those things where I did learn there is a utility in having unbiased observers who are unarmed, who can't influence the outcome of events, but at least eyes and ears on events happening in a contested place. And for the people living there, that's really their only opportunity to make a complaint to an unbiased body, whether it's able to be resolved, but at least the people in those areas know that the United Nations is there and there is some interest in them because the UN is still there.
Would people come up to you as like part of the UN? They see the blue helmets and things. Would people come up to you and like ask for help or things like that? Or was it really kind of a third party watchdog? You're just like observing and you can't, like, how much can you actually play a role in anything?
Each place is different because it depends on the rules of the game and what the what legal coverage the UN has in that particular area of operations and what it's allowed to do and not to do. But occasionally, we might get a task to, there have been reports about something happened in some place. So you would go and then interview people in that area to try and get to the bottom of what actually happened. So sometimes it's sometimes it's top down tasking that you would be asked to go and do something, and other times it's bottom up. So so at one stage, sometimes people come up to the observation post and you could with a complaint, whether you could resolve it or not is a completely different matter, and sometimes you just have to tell them, well, that's not what we do, but at least those people knew that there was a body that they could go up to. But occasionally there were one or two things that you could take up higher that the average person in South Lebanon had come up to the observation post and asked about. And sometimes, because you're mobile all the time and driving through the villages and speaking to the village mayors and the key people who influence things, you also get requests from people in the villages through the mayor about whether something can be done about this or that. And again, sometimes you can facilitate answers to those requests, and sometimes they're well and truly out of your area of responsibility. And just as long as you're kind of upfront and tell them, no, listen, that's not something that we could possibly do, or B, well, listen, we'll have a look at it and come back to you. But at least they know that they have a voice, rather than having to deal with pro-Israeli authorities or Lebanese government, which really wasn't influencing much in South Lebanon at that stage. So I think that's important for people to understand, even if the conflict itself is kind of frozen diplomatically, that for individuals who are trapped in that, so long as there's a third party like the UN who is located in there, at least they feel that they have an opportunity to have their voices heard, as opposed to the UN not being there, which would be much worse situation. So the UN's not solving their problems or not solving the conflict, but it's helping to maintain the stasis and giving them potentially a voice to the world.
Yeah, okay. It's so easy to, like, obviously I've heard critiques on the UN, like they have no teeth and things like that, but it's when you compare it to what's the alternative.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so easy to tear something down, but it's very like hard to replace something.
Yeah, no, and that's, I think that is the point, and the thing that I came away with was that is the point. What is the alternative?
Yeah.
And in some places, the UN is not the kind of military. It's not a military body, and it doesn't have the teeth, because you don't necessarily want the UN to have that kind of extraterritorial power. You just want the UN for for conflicts that require a military solution. You want UN authorization. You don't want UN forces to do it for all the kind of obvious reasons. But if there's a peace that you want kept, or a conflict that you want kept a lid on, then UN is good, potentially good for that.
My only experience with the UN is my background is Turkish Cypriot. I don't know if you know about all that.
All right,
expert in Cyprus. I want to talk to you about that. There's crossing the border. There's a UN police.
Yeah.
That's the only experience I've had with the UN, and I can see what you mean with it. It's not really military. It's kind of just there to maintain stability, I guess. So they're doing it so well, and they don't need teeth in that instance. That's a good
that's another. Cyprus is another good example that the situation is not going anywhere, but having the UN there, allows it to, it means that at least the international people understand there is an international interest in the conflict, even if it's not being resolved.
Yeah. So what's it like? You're obviously living in these, well, you were there for a year. First, just a bit of context on, was this 2006 in Lebanon? Right?
No, this is 1994 and 1995. So,
was that when all the Arab countries tried to invade Israel, then Israel took everything and then gave it all back later? Was that right? Can you explain that?
You're probably referring to 1973. So 1967 war was a 6-day war, and then 1973 Yom Kippur War, where Israel fought on multiple fronts, and that's not really much to do with the UN roles that I had. It is, because the 1967 line, particularly in the Golan Heights, was territory that Israel had taken, but is officially recognised as Syrian territory, but the Israelis have not handed it back and are building on it. So it's still Syrian territory, but held by Israel. So that's the conflict that's kind of in stasis. And then the fact that Israel controls South Lebanon for a period of time was as a result of the 1982 conflict, where Israel invaded Lebanon, went all the way up to Beirut, and when they withdrew back, there's a very natural line in South Lebanon. It's called the Litani River. It's quite a deep gorge. It's a pretty natural border. And so Israel withdrew its troops to the south of the Litani River and said, we're going to keep a security zone here. We're going to keep troops in South Lebanon up to the Litani River. And they kept them in there from 1982 until they withdrew in 2000. So I was there in the kind of just after halfway, I suppose, in 1994 or in 1995 in Lebanon.
Could you, this is sounds like a weird question, but could you feel the tension in the air in those kind of conflict zones, especially with so many civilians and towns around?
No, because it's different kind of, it's not, it's like Cyprus. It's not.
They just get used to it, I guess.
Yeah, and it's still, so there was still, there was activity in, nothing going on in the Golan Heights on the Syrian, so very, very cruisy. Much more active in South Lebanon because there was still a conflict going on between Hezbollah and other armed actors and the Israeli military.
Yeah.
so there was certainly much more going on there, but nothing on the Golan Heights. And that's probably reflective of, in such a small area, you can have one area which is completely quiet. It's been quiet for decades, or had been quiet for decades. Then there's South Lebanon, which was bubbling away as a kind of low-level insurgency that would kind of peak at various times, but was a slow boil attack by Lebanese armed elements against the Israeli military that over the course of time, over the 18 years that the Israelis were there, finally forced the Israelis to withdraw, because there was what's the point of still being there after 18 years where you haven't actually achieved anything and soldiers are just dying? So that's when they withdrew in 2000. So yeah, two different scenarios. And in South Lebanon, like everywhere else, some villages were obviously more taciturn, I suppose, and other villages were more kind of open and friendly, and that often had stuff to do with their geographic position, which kind of influenced the way the villages looked at the world.
Yeah, okay. Aside from, so you did a year for the UN in Lebanon, is that right?
6 months in Syria and 6 months in Lebanon.
6 months in Syria. And were you deployed anywhere else in the Middle East, whether the UN or Australia, Afghanistan?
Yeah, so then when I was in the embassy in Abu Dhabi, the Israel-Hezbollah war happened in 2006.
Yeah.
And we've got an embassy in there in Beirut, but we don't have any military representation, or didn't have any military representation there. So I got sent over there when the war started, essentially as a de facto attaché. It's called liaison officer. And then the Americans had started, the airport had been bombed, so it was unusable, but the Americans had started an air bridge between Cyprus and the US Embassy in Beirut. So I flew to Cyprus and then used the air bridge to the US Embassy, and then just stayed as the liaison officer. And then the ADF sent another team shortly after, and to conduct the evacuation of Australian citizens from Lebanon. And I think we evacuated about 5,500 Australian and foreign citizens from there. And so that lasted probably about 6 weeks all up. And then I stayed as the liaison officer for kind of the next 18 months, based in Abu Dhabi, but would go kind of every month over to Beirut just to maintain relations with all the people that you've got to maintain relations with.
So you've lived in all these countries, which, well, I don't really know, but like for me, and I'm sure people listening, we've never visited them, let alone lived in them, like for a long period of time, where you can kind of get to know the culture and things like that. So what's the reality of like living on the ground in all these? Because we only see, well, for me, I see Syria on the news and that's it. So what's the reality of living on the ground in these places?
Well, again, bearing in mind it's been a while. I mean, I go to Lebanon pretty regularly still, and other countries in the Middle East regularly still for my academic work. But each of those places really loved living. Loved living in Damascus. My wife came as well, so that was before we had kids. So just a fantastic. Syria was a beautiful place, friendly people. Damascus, wonderful city. Lebanon has got its own attractions. It's a small country, but it's just, if you could kind of harness it's such a small country of contrast, some of the best educated people with best private education facilities, including tertiary education facilities, but also very poorly equipped state-based education, diversity of religious identities, but a wonderful sense of fun and wonderful food culture, very vibrant artistic and music culture as well, some physically beautiful parts of the country, but also some crappily developed parts of the country as well. You know, it's just one of those kind of whole stark contrasts in a really small area. And again, Beirut is a really great city. Riyadh we really liked, and it's very situational dependent, because we were kind of lucky, that the people in the embassy were really good. That makes a big difference. We found some other people with young kids as well, because we had young kids by that stage. That makes things a lot easier. And I always kind of said, and we did lots of, because you couldn't get a tourist visa to Saudi, there's not many expats. And so we tried as much as possible to kind of holiday inside Saudi, which was, again, fantastic. So we got to see a large part of Saudi while we were there. But I always say how back then, so it was 2005, so how you enjoy Saudi was what state of, or what age and state of life you're at. So generally, if you were young without kids, you either loved it or hated it. And that depended whether you're kind of outdoorsy person or whatever. People with young kids like us, really good, so safe. And if you found other people with young kids, it was really, it was good. It was a really nice life. If you were at a stage where your kids had grown up, again, lots of stuff to do. It was really good. If you were there with teenage children, really hard, because everything that teenage children want to do, they couldn't do. So it was hard for people with teenage children, and potentially hard for some young adults.
Are you talking about going out and things like that?
Yeah, going out in particular. Drinking. The embassies were allowed to have alcohol, but unless you knew somebody in that kind of circle, then that's much harder. And so, you could always do the dash to Bahrain, which lots of people did for the weekend, just where you can drink alcohol. But if you're outdoorsy,
over the weekend.
But if you're outdoorsy and sporty, living in Riyadh, there was quite a bit to do. There was like lots of clubs, sporting kind of clubs, expat sporting clubs, where people were all trying to find things to do on the weekend, and lots of people, ourselves included, camping. So it was. We always look back on it with very fond memories.
I've talked to my friends about this. Just in Australia, I feel like the culture is you go to the pub and you drink, that kind of thing. So it's like, what do you want to do on a Saturday? Oh, we'll go to the pub and we'll drink. So in that context where that's taken away, what do people do? Like 20s kind of thing, go camping, play sports. So is that it? Because I'm sure it can be done. I'm just so curious to.
Or you go out. Yeah, you can do that. You can during summer. Part of the problem with summer, it's called summer bachelors, because people with young families, because schools close down. Most of the Saudis go on extended holidays to get out of the heat. So there's not much going on during summer because it's too hot to camp or do anything. So that period is quite dead. But outside of that, when things are all happening normally, if you're staying in Riyadh, there's always people's place to go over to. There's the sporting scene, but if you don't want to do that and you want to get away, then you just fly to Dubai or Abu Dhabi, or drive a few hours to Bahrain. So you might not go there every weekend, but to go out to drink. But if you want to do it, it's within pretty easy reach. So, but you just wouldn't do it every weekend. But you'd probably do it, once a month at least, just to get out and decompress. And then, of course, it's so easy to get to. So that's what most people kind of did.
Yeah. Okay. And that Saudi is is everyone covered there? Like all the women? Is that right?
Yeah. And again, things have changed under the current Crown Prince, but in 2005, women were covered. You didn't, if you're a Western woman, you didn't, you had to wear an abaya, so you had to wear a cloak.
Yeah.
But you didn't have to cover your head, but they would always carry a scarf.
Mm.
And depending on the circumstances, you might put a scarf on. And sometimes, occasionally, people politely asked if the woman could put a scarf on. You didn't have to do it if you didn't want
Out
to.
of respect kind of thing.
Yeah. But yeah, and again, it just became just part of living in Saudi. But inside the compound, so security was a big thing at that stage. So for all the Western compounds, all the compounds where Westerners lived, there was a security element, but the Saudi National Guard protected every compound.
Mm-hmm.
So inside, and they're all walled. So inside the walled compound, you didn't have to wear. You could wear whatever you wanted inside the compound. But once you went out, but there was one time when we ran out of bread, and it was so I had to go out of the compound and into the street and go to a baker. And I don't know why I did it, but I was in shorts.
Yeah.
And so I just got in the car. And normally I'd never. You always change in long pants before you go out. That's another thing. You don't wear shorts outside. But I don't know. It's just kind of absent-minded. So I was in my shorts and kind of did what you do back at home, and then drove and went into the bakery, and everybody's looking at me. I'm going, what do I? No, I don't know. No idea why they're looking at me.
Yeah.
And then they're all everybody's fine, but just staring at me.
Yeah.
And then I got back in the car with my bread. And then when I got back in the car, I kind of that was when the penny drop. Went, oh shit, I'm wearing shorts.
And so, do you ever look around here, Australian culture and people, and you're like, you guys have no idea what it's like in other places? Because we don't.
No, but we don't. But I kind of think
it is
really
what it
need to.
Yeah. Well,
it'd be nice if people were culturally exposed to different things, but you can't. Everybody can't be exposed to everybody else's culture. And I kind of like our kind of laid back. Going to the pub.
Like a new country, I guess.
In comparison, not going to the pub every night, but going to the pubs. I like going to the pub. But I like catching up with friends at the pub. That's a good, that's a good part of that's part of our culture.
Yeah.
Might not be high culture, but it's culture.
Yeah, true. So you did your Middle East touring, then you came back here to Australia, Canberra. Is that right?
Yeah.
And did you do your studying in Islam before you discharged?
Yeah, so I did. Everybody in the army, you're never in the army for your whole life. So everybody at different times thinks, what are you going to do when I get out? And at that stage, I had a chemistry degree, but I'd done an arts degree at Macquarie just because I knew I was never going to do chemistry. Higher further study in hard sciences. So, but I couldn't do any postgrad work with just a chemistry degree. So I had to kind of reverse engineer it and go back and do an arts degree. So I had that before we went off to the Middle East, and then I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I'd done a little bit of Middle East stuff in that arts degree. But once we kind of got there, that was like, I knew this is the place that kind of pushed my buttons. So I took some long service leave after we were in the Middle East. And so we went backpacking for a couple of months, my wife and I. And the internet was just coming in, but there wasn't that much on it. So there wasn't much content. So I knew I was getting posted to Canberra. So I said, I'll do a master's in international relations at ANU, and I'll specialise in the Middle East, thinking that's what I was going to do. And then, but we were still in that era where you had to do post-restant at main post offices in cities. So we were backpacking around, and I was communicating back and forth using the post restant system.
Were you backpacking around Australia?
No, backpacking around. We kind of flew to Turkey and then went from Turkey and then Eastern Europe and then headed west and then flew back to Australia from the UK.
Wow.
So we did that for a couple of months. So when he came back,
What was that like? That sounds mad.
Yeah, no, that was good. Yeah, and then we also, we did another backpacking tour through Iran and then Yemen in a couple of years after that. So really got do like the Middle East. But then when we came out to Canberra and did the Masters of International Relations, and it wasn't until I kind of got back to Canberra and enrolled, and I was going to choose all my Middle Eastern subjects, that the International Relations degree at ANU is based at the Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies. So you can't do any Middle Eastern stuff. You can only do Asian stuff, which I wasn't particularly interested in.
Yeah.
But so you do the core subjects, which are not geographically based, but the geographic electives are all our region. So, but it was too late to change. I couldn't change. So I was kind of stuck. So I did that that year, and then the next year I did a Master of Middle East and Central Asian Studies. So it was really at ANU, and that was really enjoyable. So I thought, well, the next obvious thing is to do a PhD, and because I've been in Southern Lebanon, it's quite heavily populated with Shi'a sect of Islam, and there hadn't been, there wasn't much written at all really on the Shi'a, Lebanese Shi'a. So I thought, well, that's something. And so that was what so I approached Professor Ahmed Shapour at Sydney Uni about doing a PhD when I was posted at Holsworthy. And so I started that when I was posted to Sydney, but I think in September of that year, Timor blew up, so I didn't actually do anything in that first year. And then when we got posted away to Victoria, and I kind of for a year, and when I came back, and I did a little bit more there, but then I got posted back to Sydney, and I kind of accelerated and finished there. So I was finished my PhD before I went to the Defence Attaché jobs. So
you go.
Yeah, no, so that was, I'd kind of become academically qualified, I suppose. And again, as I tell people, when people say, why did you do PhD in that? Because, we weren't particularly interested in, Australia wasn't engaged or interested in the Middle East at that stage. And I said, well, it's lots of my friends who are in the army who were getting out were doing MBAs and that kind of stuff because they thought that would equip them for life after the military. And for some it did. It was a perfect decision for them. But, that just never pushed my buttons at all. And I didn't really know what was pushing my buttons. But once we kind of started going to the Middle East, I thought, right, I've now found what interests me.
Yeah.
So I don't really care whether the army's interested in it. It might interest me. And it satisfies my intellectual curiosity that you keep on pursuing a subject until the natural conclusion of your study into that, which is doing a PhD in it. So I did that for reasons that suited me. And then lo and behold, in 2003, the invasion of Iraq. Iraq's got this big Shia population, and then so shit, we really didn't know about the Middle East. So as I tell people, lots of people came up to me after here in the army and said, listen, I'm really kind of interested in kind of doing something after the army and kind of interested in this or that. And they were all really current events that they were talking about that they want to get qualified academically. And I'd say to them, well, listen, it's too late now because the world's interest moves in mysterious ways. Yeah, so now, if you're a Ukraine expert, then now's your time in the spotlight.
I
But
love
you need to,
with someone from that study UK Russia.
yeah. But that's why I say to people, don't try and chase
Hype.
the current trend or the currently sexy thing, because by the time you're qualified in the PhD, the world's moved on. So choose something that interests you and study it to its logical conclusion. And if the world spotlight doesn't shine on that particular thing, then at least you're personally satisfied.
Yeah.
And perhaps choose a subject that is got some geographic specificity to it, but also thematic specificity. So I can talk on Middle East geographically, but I can also talk thematically about Islam, and particularly Shia Islam. So that gives you kind of two cogs.
Yeah. Not to mention you've been to most of the Middle East, from my understanding.
But it helps. They're all kind of layers of, you've got to be there to kind of experience it, but then you've got to be academically qualified to kind of understand it. And having a military background helps you understand the security aspects of it as well. So it's kind of a whole package, but part of that is the academic qualifications. So, back to that original question, I did it because it interested me. Didn't interest anybody else at the time that I did it, but that was fine. And if nothing ever came of it, I would have been intellectually satisfied having done it, because the PhD is not it's not a test of your intellect. It's a test of your ability to kind of finish a task that you set out on, because it's a long and kind of lonely road at times. But everybody who does a PhD, it's a testament to their ability to finish the task, not kind of intellectual acumen necessarily. It's more persistence and the ability to finish the task.
Yeah. Okay. So can you speak Arabic or any of the?
I used to be able to speak it, not too bad, but now I'm not a natural at it. But I haven't been back for 2 years because of COVID. But I'm going back there the end of next week.
Really?
So
where are you going?
I've got Turkey and Lebanon.
Oh, nice. It's cheap in Turkey at the moment.
Oh, man, that's in the bottom for me. It's even, man.
My aunt went before COVID, and I'm pretty sure she was saying she was spending $4 on like a banquet of food, things like that. It's pretty cheaper now. Where are you going in Turkey?
I'm just going to Istanbul for the Istanbul half marathon, and then I'll go down to Lebanon. And you don't need you just need your for Turkey, you just need your vaccination certificate and to fill out a form, an online form.
I thought you needed a PCR. My sister's going in July, and I was on the phone to her yesterday. I thought she said you need a negative PCR as well. No.
No.
And how exciting, hey?
So I've downloaded the form. You just have to give them the dates of all of your vaccinations, type of vaccine.
Yeah. Okay.
And then it spits out the form for you, and then you got to fill out another form within 72 hours of entering. But you don't have to do the PCR test. So.
Oh, that's pretty good.
Yeah. Well, sorry, but they do say you could be subject to a random one when you land. So they're doing random ones on landing.
Yeah. Okay. I meant rapid as well, not PCR. I meant rapid. Yeah. Like with all this, whenever I talk about Middle East to my family or things, like my mom's first response is it's dangerous. And we're even like Turkish, like we have that background and we feel like it's dangerous. But like it's not dangerous, is it? Like anywhere's dangerous in any sense.
Yeah, it depends what you're talking about. I take we took the family on holidays all around the place. It's not dangerous per se. And the only dangerous places are parts of Syria, obviously, parts of Iraq, Yemen's a basket case.
I was going to ask you about Yemen.
But outside of that, things are pretty.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I'm like, you hear one thing on the news 6 months ago and your mind's caught on that. That kind of, it's just wog.
No, but no, it's I suppose the thing is, parts of the area can be volatile, so things can change quite quickly in some parts of the area. But by and large, no, it's a great, it's a great area that's continually fascinated me. So it's kind of the place I like.
Yeah, I feel like you can tell me or confirm, it's like less touched by the West, a lot of places there. So I think that has a charm to it. Would you agree?
The world is getting smaller. There's no doubt about that. But I think that's also part of it. What you said, perception is reality sometimes. So if people perceive that it's a dangerous area, then they won't go. So, but then again, a lot of the countries, like Jordan, for instance, needs tourism dollars because it doesn't have much else to generate income through. So, it's a bit, but I do think there's a lot in that thing about the perception that it's a dangerous place where it's not, not in reality.
Yeah.
But certain parts of it, but but I always say, certain parts that you might perceive, let's say in Beirut, as more dangerous than others. They're also not the kind of places that you want to be going if you were to go to Lebanon or go to Beirut.
Yeah.
The kind of parts that are potentially dangerous are not the attractive parts of Beirut. So if you're going there is to look at things, just look at things in the parts of Beirut that have got things to look at that are interesting.
Yeah. So you've chosen Middle East as your life's kind of study. I've got so many questions about what's happening right now in different places.
Yeah.
Okay. Yemen first. I very rarely hear it in the news, and like you said, it's a basket case. Could you give a quick rundown of what's going on there from your opinion?
Yes, it's I suppose the caveat to start with by I'm not a Yemen expert, but having been there several times and backpacked through it, it's the one thing that strikes you, particularly with my military hat on, anybody who's crazy enough to invade that country and think they can control it has got rocks in their head. The Egyptians tried it in the 1960s, they failed spectacularly. And so why the Saudis thought they could do it is just beyond me. It's a little bit like Afghanistan in that there's certain things in military history that never change. And one of those is terrain. Like, terrain is terrain. The world is built as the world is. And countries that have terrain like Afghanistan and Yemen are virtually impossible to control because there's so many places. The way the country is, it really, or the countries are, it favours the defender because the nature of the terrain is such. So back to Yemen. So essentially, what broke open the can of worms, I suppose, two things that broke it up. There's not, like a lot of these artificial countries, there's not one Yemen. Like southern Yemenis consider themselves quite different to the northern Yemenis.
Is there a Sunni Shia divide?
There's a Sunni Zaidi divide. So within Shiism, so mainstream Shiism called a 12er Shia.
Yeah.
And that's your standard Shia. So Iran, Kuwait, Lebanon, Bahrain, they're all 12er Shia. But there's there's a couple of subsects of the Shia. One of them are called Zaydis. So, and they're really only confined to Yemen and parts of what used to be Yemen, but are now Saudi. So Najran on the border. There are some Zaydis who are Saudi citizens, but essentially they're kind of.
And what are Saudi?
So Saudis are Sunnis, except there's about 10% who are Shia, and they're on the eastern. In the east, there's a small community in Medina, but they're in the east opposite Bahrain, and Bahrain is majority Shia as well. So these Zaydis, they're not ideologically, they have a common start point in Shiism, but then they diverge markedly from mainstream Shiism to the point where they're essentially two different religions, but they share a common start point. That's probably the best way to put it. So when people say they're Shia and therefore they're pro-Iranian, they're not actually Shia, as we know Shia, they're Zaydis. And because it's such a small minority, they don't exist. There's not a big diaspora of Zaydis outside who can support the Zaydis inside Yemen. So once, so go back a step. The Zaydis believed, the Zaydis really in the north of Yemen, they believed that there was proselytizing to the Sunni faith being funded by the Saudis in the north, being abetted by the central Yemeni government in Sana'a. And so there had been a series of conflicts between the central government and these Zaydis, who are known as the Houthi movement, after the leader. And there are about 6 phases of this conflict been going on for a number of years. In the last phase of it, the Houthis were able to not only cement their authority within the north, they kept on coming south and they took over the capital.
Yeah.
And at the same time, a separate government was, Yemeni government was set up, recognised, a bit of a bodgy election, but recognised by the UN and supported by the Saudis. And in 2015, Mohammed bin Salman, the current Crown Prince of Saudi, who was then Defence Minister, launched an aerial offensive and later kind of Arab coalition ground invasion of Yemen, designed to defeat the Houthis and put their man back in power in Sana'a. We're now in 2022, so 7 years later, and the fighting's more or less a stalemate. The Gulfis have lost interest, but there's been enormous damage done to Yemeni infrastructure. The country is still effectively in a civil war. And the South had previously had a Marxist, there was a communist republic in the south of the country in the 1960s. In South Yemen. So there's always been a kind of separatist sentiment in the south. And part of the problem is if the Gulf Arab coalition backing the southern separatists against the Houthis, at some point, southern separatists are going to say, well, we actually want to become separate as well. So there's several layers, as there always is in a Middle Eastern conflict. There's several layers in this. There's a kind of nationalist rebellion. There's a kind of southern separatist versus northern Yemeni element to it. There's the Houthi element versus the Sunnis in the south. And because, as you said at the start, the Zaydis are essentially friendless because they don't have any natural ideological partners or a diaspora population to support them. The Iranians saw this because they have a common start point. They understand them better. And if the Iranians come knocking at your door saying, listen, we're happy to logistically support you because that'll really piss off the Saudis, and you have no other friends, then you go,
dumb not to
come on board. And so therefore another layer gets put on it and becomes part of the broader Iranian Arab conflict, even though it's not ideological. This is simply transactional between the Iranians and the Houthis, because the Houthis now have this big friend who can logistically support them, and which is one of the reasons why the Houthis have been being able to kind of launch drone attacks and missile attacks against the UAE and Saudi Arabia, even though they've been pummeled from the air for 7 years. So the conflict is in stalemate. It's a humanitarian disaster at the same time. and there's no the Gulf states have kind of lost interest, more or less. They have essentially withdrawn their forces, and so that conflict is in a period of stasis and will be for the foreseeable future. As I said, it's a basket case.
Do you think, I've heard of many people or read, I don't even know, but it was like the Middle East is always so conflict heavy at the moment because after World War II, it was divided up based on like the French and English. Like it wasn't based on cultural differences.
Yeah.
And then people
After World War One,
World War One, sorry. So people are like clogged together that are different people. So then that inevitably leads to conflict.
Yeah, I mean, so a fair question is what's always put there, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and leading to the creation of artificial states, which is true, but it's that question that you said: do people of backgrounds inevitably have to come into conflict, or can you develop a sense of nationalism? I mean, it's quite interesting. You could argue that Jordan, it's as artificial as any other of the countries, yet they have a very strong sense of national identity due to strong leadership. There are.
Does Jordan have
inevitable question? Say again.
Does Jordan have oil money?
No,
I was going to say,
got no oil money. It's got a small Christian population, overwhelmingly Sunni, so it doesn't have the kind of religious fractures that other artificial states might have. It had the Palestinian, still has Palestinian issues.
Mm-hmm.
They're one of its fault lines, but it's been remarkable in terms of the kind of national identity forged. And people would often say, and I do agree to a degree, the Saudis would be the first to say, well, we're the only kind of Arab state that set our own borders. Everybody else's borders were set for them by somebody else. But, even Saud set the borders of modern Saudi Arabia, so we're a real country because we set our borders. And that does give them a strong sense of national identity.
Yeah.
But then you can go to Lebanon, where completely artificially created as a kind of home for the Christians by the French. But by creating that for all the reasons why they had to append different bits of the old Ottoman system to make it kind of what they thought was a functioning country. They included a polyglot of different sectarian groups that have made it very difficult for the country to function. But so there is merit in that argument. And I always tell people that if you want to read a book about the Middle East to kind of try and understand the Middle East, which is very difficult to do, there's a book called Multiple Identities of the Middle East. And I always think that's one of the best books. It's a very easy book to read. But it just gives you a sense about how, I think, in Australia, it's what we call ourselves multicultural. By and large, pretty monocultural. There's no real tribal identities that fracture or dictate the way that people look at things. Ethnic identities, to a degree, but they come and go as they have with all kind of generations. Religious, not really, in a kind of secular country. Whereas in lots of the Middle Eastern countries, you have multiple identities that dictate how you view an issue. Lebanon, for instance, your religious identity can be a big determining factor of your identity. In certain parts, in urban areas, not so much, but certainly in some of the rural areas, your tribal identity is certainly a strong issue. Your family identity, so your family name, can be important. Your ethnic identity can still be very important. Are you Arab? Are you Armenian? And in some cases, where you are from in Lebanon, even so, such a small country, you've got to vote in your home village. You don't relocate yourself. So where you are physically or your parents or family members physically from, that can also dictate the way that you look at an issue. So there's like 5 strong potential centers of attraction for just one individual on any one subject. So it's very difficult to get consensus, and that's and you see that in the political systems with the plethora of political parties in some of the countries, particularly ones that are starting out, because everybody wants their particular interests to be recognised, and they're normally really small sectoral interests. They're not a Labor Party movement that wants to better conditions for everybody in that kind of normal Labor Party thing, or a kind of conservative movement of just incremental changes, have the market dictate the economy to as great an extent as we can. Yeah, you don't have those big ideas that unite everybody. You have kind of small things which just reinforces your identity, and also and it also dictates how you have to if you have religious parties, religiously identifiable parties in parliament, which you do in Lebanon, which you do in Iraq, that forces you to identify yourself by your religion. So your parliamentary representation is based on your religious identity. So how can I have a national identity? Because the parliamentary system puts my religious identity before my national identity. It's a component part of it. So the system is telling me to identify as by my religious identity. So for all of, not just the Sykes-Picot thing, but it's also the power. That's why I think this book is good, because it gives you a sense of how powerful multiple identities can be in the Middle East amongst individuals in a way that people in the West kind of just don't understand, because it's foreign to them, because you can put your national identity way above anything else, and then your other identities are just kind of minor if they exist, and they're just kind of personal, but they don't affect you at the macro level, and at the macro level everybody's really got that national identity.
My Lebanese friend says nothing will change in Lebanon because all the Muslims vote for the Muslims and all the Christians vote for the Christians.
Well, the system makes you do it. That's part of it. Yeah, that is true, what he says. But it's also one of the frustrating
no matter what the
things.
policy is, it's like, if you're Muslim, I'll just vote for you, and then the same.
But it's like everybody knows what the solution is, but nobody will do the solution because everybody's afraid of the solution.
And what's the solution?
Doing away with religiously segregated parliamentary seats, and also allow secret voting, like an Australian system of voting, and do away with religious. So change the whole electoral system, which is essentially what a former Interior Minister who was directed to come up with the electoral reform plan came up with. But the people who need to vote in the electoral reform plan are exactly the kind of people whose positions are going to fall apart as soon as the reform plan is implemented. And if we think most politicians are self-centered to a greater or lesser degree, Lebanese politicians are massively self-centered. So there's no way they're even going to vote for the change that everybody kind of knows should be done. And that's part of the kind of frustration, because even in that kind of system, there's people like, I think it was Zed Baruch, who was the Interior Minister at the time, highly capable, really good, capable politician, knows what the problems are, knows what the solution is, zero chance of advancing either of those. So again, one of the frustrating things about Lebanon, so many talented people, but the system lets them down, and they're incapable of changing the system.
Interesting. Moving you on to Afghanistan. What's the go there? I'm just going to touch on countries and get your opinion on them quickly, and then.
There's always the unknowns, isn't it? The what if moments in history. So I still don't think there was any, after September the 11th, there was no alternative. You had to take military action against the Taliban in Afghanistan. Really, you had to. And it was authorised by the UN. Nobody was standing in your way. However, as I said before, massively difficult country. As the British found out, over a century ago, just the terrain, geographical terrain, and the human terrain, and a multiplicity of difficult borders that lend itself to having a successful insurgency, because you can never really stop it. There's too many holes to try and plug. So we've taken all of your focus to make that a long-term success. So 18 months after you do that, or thereabouts, you then turn around and invade Iraq. So therefore you split your attention, and Iraq became the main game for years, and Afghanistan was kind of backwater. So the unanswerable question is, if Iraq had never happened, would the outcome of Afghanistan been any different? Because the focus would have been on that rather than this bifurcated focus. Well, it wasn't really bifurcated because Iraq was where the action was, and Afghanistan was kind of holding pattern. And in that holding pattern, allow the Taliban to kind of regroup. Too few troops, too lower priority on the diplomatic front, on military front, on the economic front, on all the fronts. So, okay, that having been said, still lots of blood and treasure was spent on Afghanistan, and there were some tangible gains made in terms of reduction in infant mortality rates, a rise in the average life expectancy, much broader level of education and healthcare to the population. So real advances were made. Does that justify all the expense that went to it? That's for other people to decide. But the one place where it didn't kind of make a material difference was in the ability of the Afghan military to defend the country.
Yeah.
And so when push came to shove, a much better equipped military folded so quickly against the Taliban. And when people say, it's always what the Americans call it the Monday morning quarterback, everybody's hindsight's always 2020. People say, oh, well, you should have known that there was a paper tiger, and as soon as somebody blew on it, it would fall over. Nobody thought that it would collapse as calamitously as it did. And evidence of that is, Hamid Karzai and the ministers, they're all still in Afghanistan. All the cards are falling. If they knew what was happening, they wouldn't have been there. The Taliban were really slow they didn't kind of understand that this was happening before them. They expected a kind of a slow advance and a attritional period of warfare around the major capital cities. And they essentially walked into the place. They weren't ready for it. And so when the White House says, listen, we didn't understand it was going to happen this quickly, I take them at face value, because the other people who if you think people should have known it was going to happen, neither the Afghan civil leadership nor the Taliban appeared to know that it was going to happen. It took them by surprise. So I think it just took everybody by surprise. And it's one of those, again, those imponderables. You can train a military, you can equip a military, but you can't make a military fight. So you can see in Ukraine at the moment, there is Ukraine military, well equipped against a far superior enemy, numerically superior, who's got air superiority in parts, and they are fighting tooth and nail and exacting a very heavy toll on the Russians, making it very difficult for them to claim every kilometre of ground that they're achieving. So simply fighting a superior enemy doesn't mean that you kind of fall away. Here's the Ukrainians are showing a very good example of what you can do if you have a very determined military who are willing to fight for the country. Then you switch over to Afghanistan, they kind of, a few pockets fought bravely, but by and large, the military kind of collapsed. you can't engender that fighting spirit from without. It's got to be done within. So there'll be lots of questions asked, for years in the future about why did they collapse so quickly. But I think you can't get away from the fact that at some point the Afghan military's got to take a large part of the blame, because they're the ones who kind of ran away. And which part of the Afghan military? Well, it was the officer leadership that was unable to instill the confidence in them. Was it the corruption at all levels? It meant the logistic support was not with them. Was it this notion of multiple identities that they didn't, that are so ingrained that their individual identities mattered to them more than the national identity and fighting for Afghanistan, because what Afghanistan meant to outsiders was less than what the concept of Afghanistan meant to some of the Afghans in the Afghan military. I mean, these are, again, interesting and very difficult questions, and possibly we'll never have the answer to them, because an individual's decision to fight or flee is oftentimes an individual decision, unless whole units kind of decamp, which is kind of possible. But yeah, it's and now we're in that situation where the Taliban, you reap what you shall sow. Are they willing or able to maintain the advances that we in life indicators that we said before? And if they're willing to do it, are they able to do it under the kind of sanctions regime that is against them? And if so, how long will that sanctions regime stay in place? There's lots of sticks that the West have got against the Taliban, and you can ease them off incrementally if the Taliban show that Western interests are being looked after, which is essentially make sure it's not going to be a base for Al Qaeda or Islamic State in the future, and as far as is possible, observe what is an acceptable standard of human rights. Acceptable, who determines what the acceptable level of human rights is? That's up to that's going to be up to. Sorry, mate.
All good.
Just running out of power. That's going to be up to other people to. So that's going to be up to other people to determine. But yeah, it's but yeah, again, it's not good, but it's not as it's sometimes hard to tell because of the difficulty of getting information from it. But it doesn't seem to have been the kind of Armageddon that people feared when the Taliban took over. There's certainly Taliban Islamic rule being implemented. The future for educated people, particularly educated women, is not going to be what it was prior to them taking over. But at what level is it going to level out at? I don't know. I don't think any of us know at the moment. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, it's yet another kind of Afghan tragedy, I suppose. But the imponderable is, I don't know that. Where the West could have done more was in the early days when it took its eye off the ball for Iraq.
Do you think that people want the Taliban in Afghanistan?
Yeah, good question.
Because it's,
and again, when you say what do you mean by people, there's the urban divide.
Exactly.
If you're in the nice part of Kabul, there's no way you want the Taliban.
Yeah. Okay.
If you're down in provinces next to Pakistan, hey, I didn't really know who the previous people were, and they didn't affect my life. Taliban seemed to be okay. So again, there'll be certainly people who, and roughly along the lines of urbanized elite definitely don't want them. People out in the provinces, much more difficult to get a read, and if the Taliban don't intrude on their lives, they probably don't care who is looking after the province. And again, that's part of yeah, it is a very good question. I think it's one we don't ask ourselves often enough, because media and academic researchers don't often go past urbanized areas for a range of reasons. And even if you were to go outside of the urbanized areas, how to get a good feel of general sentiment amongst Afghans, because what northern rural Afghans are thinking about is going to be different to what southern. Yeah, I always think, if the pollsters in the US with the most sophisticated polling techniques never had a good read on Trump getting in, or the pollsters in Australia couldn't foresee that Morrison got into the last election, how in the hell are people supposed to come up with good predictions of what the average Afghan thinks about the Taliban? Because it's just impossible. I think it's an impossible task.
Yeah.
But yeah, to your first point, certainly we shouldn't think that Taliban victory was horrible to everybody in Afghanistan, because it obviously wasn't. Now, who welcomes them and who doesn't welcome them, and who's going to tolerate them in this year, next year, 5 years to come, those are different questions.
Yeah. Okay. You've been very generous with your time. I just want to ask you.
That's right.
I have to ask you about Erdogan and stuff, as being a Turk. What do you think about the area of the world?
I mean, again, it's not my specialization, but I would probably say just a couple of things. One, I mean, he's a very good, and you see this in the Middle East quite a lot. And Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince of Saudi, is similar in that both of them know their domestic constituents so well. MBS knows what the Saudi youth want, and he's got a 50-year vision of him being king for 50 years. So he's looking at half century worth of stability. Erdogan, mayor of Istanbul, very cluey domestic politician, knows how to extinguish opposition domestically, knows which buttons to push. But because they're good domestically, they don't understand that the world does not dance their tune.
Yeah.
So they've been very poor foreign policy leaders. Erdogan, sometimes your strength can be a weakness. Erdogan's strength is a very good understanding of the domestic Turkish constituency. And that's a fault, because when he deals with external partners, he becomes kind of arch Turkish nationalist, thinking he's dealing with equals. In many cases, they're not his equals, and they don't treat him necessarily as an equal. So if he's making demands that he thinks is what an equal should make, then he's not going to go very well. And I think, and there's a couple of things. One is, after the Arab Spring, there was kind of, it's those windows of opportunity. After the Arab Spring, Turkey made a big play to be influential in Egypt, particularly when Morsi came in. The AKP Muslim Brotherhood connection. But even though they were to a degree ideological fellow travellers, there was a lot of pushback in Greece and other countries, because it's like, I think lots of people in Turkey don't understand that Arabs view, 500 years of Turkish colonial rule in the Arab world. They don't necessarily want.
They
don't appreciate. They're happy to deal with Turkey in a practical sense, in a transactional sense, and with all the Gulf states so concerned about Muslim Brotherhood as kind of enemy number 2 after Iran, Turkey will always have that concerns about an Erdogan type. Turkey will always be influenced by that. I think also Erdogan didn't understand after this. It becomes the politics of the personal in these kind of non-democratic countries becomes the overriding reason why decisions are made. There's no necessary rationale behind them. It's what the decision maker wanted. And when in the early part of the Syrian conflict, for instance, Assad and Erdogan always had a pretty good relationship. And certainly to start with, Erdogan tried to steer Assad the right way. But at one point, Assad, Erdogan sent his emissaries to Assad to essentially say, listen, before this thing blows up in your face, you need to give some concessions, and like real concessions, not kind of token concessions. And he unceremoniously kicked them back to Turkey. And you can trace, Erdogan took that as personal insult. That was his personal emissaries being kicked out by somebody who he was trying to help. And Erdogan from that point, there was did very little to stop the flow of foreign fighters, thinking, because we've been looking after Syrian Muslim Brotherhood for so long, we'll be able to control the outcome of this. We'll have a kind of a pro-Turkish government in Damascus, and there'll be a lesson to everybody, and so things will work out well. But just didn't understand that. It was all about Erdogan getting rid of Assad because he'd been slighted, and don't worry, we've got control over what this opposition is going to look like because he spent so long looking after them. Just not understanding the nature of the fragmented opposition and the fact that Syrian National Council, which he'd been fostering, nobody gave a shit about because they'd been living in Istanbul. They hadn't been living in Syria. So it's like Syria for the Syrians. So again, that was a poor mistake. Trying to shooting down the Russian plane, big mistake, and that and again cost him. The Russians are quite just like the Americans have been with Putin. The Russians were with Erdogan's business friends, particularly in the construction business. I think Turkey's got the third biggest construction sector in the world.
Random.
But what that means is because it's so big, it's got to have external markets because Turkish domestic market can't satisfy it. So there's quite a lot of Turkish construction going on in Russia. As soon as the Russian plane and a lot of those are big backers of Erdogan. As soon as the plane got shot down, they all so they lost a lot of money. They blame for shooting down the plane, not the person who hit the button. They blame Erdogan for doing that. So cut a long story short, I think he's still got a very strong hold on power domestically because he's just so cluey, and he's gotten rid of a lot of potential opposition. He's been very bad for Turkey's reputation internationally, I think. But it'd be interesting to see. All that doesn't matter so long as you can guarantee, like any country, you can guarantee jobs and food on plates. When your currency starts to tank and everything the prices go up for everything, then people start to look at who's ruling the country. So I think, so he's pretty cluey. I don't think this will wound him, the economic stuff. But if it doesn't, but it depends how long it goes on for. And the other issue is, any aspirations Turkey had for becoming part of Europe, they kind of died.
Yeah, that died as soon as. I think they're the ones pushing more of like a Muslim Arab stance, as opposed to that kind of.
Yeah, but see, he's caught betwixt and between. So I think his latest one is, but he's definitely looking east, and using. But again, there seems to be rapprochement at the moment as well between, Qatar. Now Qatar is back in the kind of more or less back in the Gulf camp, and I think Qatar is back. Turkey's seen in a slightly different light as well, and I think Erdogan's also pretty cautious given the economic situation. So he's trying to rapprochement with the Arab states as well. So I think it's probably the economic circumstances will be good for regional stability because it'll force Erdogan to eat some humble pie. I don't think it's going to affect his grip on power. So I think potentially with the glass half full thing, view of it, it might be overall a good thing because it ameliorate his behaviour because he's got to pay attention to his domestic constituency again because of the economic circumstances where in the past he hadn't really had to.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to end it.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time.
No worries. Good luck with that.
Very insightful, and thank you for.
How'd you get into doing this?